Well, it's been 2 years since the inauguration of President Maithripala Sirisena, 8 years since the Sirasa Depanama studio was attacked, 8 years since veteran journalist Lasantha Wickrematunge was murdered. Is justice being meted out, or is it in the process of being meted out? Today on Vantage Point, we'll also discuss some of the most biggest highlights of the week, including the deception surrounding Volkswagen and also the current story, that is the deception surrounding the tire manufacturing plant, an Italian-owned tire manufacturing plant, which Sunday Times published over the weekend. And today with me in discussion will be Dr. Dayan Jayatilaka. Thank you very much for joining.
Hi, good evening, Stephanie.
Good evening. Well, like I mentioned earlier, the deception surrounding the Volkswagen company. Why is this because the national government is under a lot of pressure to perform? Because earlier we saw Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe giving a statement, and also including the BOI had published it on its website saying that the Volkswagen company will be opened and also many job opportunities will be given to Sri Lankan nationals. Well, is it because the national government is under a lot of pressure to perform, or is it merely a statement or a misinformation that was given out to the public?
Well, there are too many such stories to be an accident. You've got the Volkswagen story, then you've got the rigid tire company story, the Italian tire company which says, hey, we are not investing. At best, we are talking about some technology transfer. And then you've got a reconciliation task force report that's not for reconciliation, but anyway. No, I mean, of course, I'm kidding, but too many stories where the facts are at variance with the government's version. Now, what does this tell us? Back during the Vietnam War, the American media came up with a term. That term is credibility gap. And that was used about President Lyndon B. Johnson, because what the president was saying, which is really what he had been told by the Pentagon, was quite different from what the American media was seeing on the ground in Vietnam. So the most prominent reporters like Walter Cronkite came up with this term, and they said the government, that there's a problem of credibility now. And it started small, but it's growing. And that's why they said a credibility gap. Now I think that this government, and here I'm not really talking about President Sirisena because he's not the one who said most of this stuff, is much more the PM and his ministers, the UNP ministers. I think they're beginning to suffer in the public eye from a credibility gap.
Well, in this backdrop, do you think former President Mahinda Rajapaksa's statement will actually come true, of him saying that there will come a day where the government will be toppled?
Well, you know, they used two different, none of this was said in English. No, well, he did speak to the foreign correspondents, but the two terms that are being used are Sinhalese terms. One is parallel, which means, you know, I suppose it literally roll over. And the other is Vattana, which means fall, or to fall, to bring down. Now, Mahinda Rajapaksa never said he was going to bring down the government. He never said Vattana. He said Paralana. Paralana means, you know, I'm going to change it. It's going to be a change. Now, is that even possible? I think it's really not possible unless you have an Arab Spring, which can't be ruled out, but is not very likely. You can't really bring down the government. But you can most certainly make some dramatic changes. You can really flip it on its back. Now, why do I say this? Look at today's world. Look at what happened in Britain. When this government here was elected to office, what was the British government? It was a Conservative government. It was in coalition with the Liberal Democrats, and the Prime Minister was David Cameron. Was David Cameron defeated at a general election? No. Is David Cameron the Prime Minister of Britain today? No. Did the Conservative government fall? No. The same goes for Italy. So it's possible to have what Mahinda Rajapaksa called a Peralina, or a changeover, a dramatic changeover of the government. It's less possible to bring it down. So, let me put it very, very simply. Come January 1, 2018, if the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka remains Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, then Mahinda Rajapaksa's gamble has failed. But come January 1, 2018, if the UNP and the SLP remain in government as the so-called unity government, but the Prime Minister has gone home or been sent home or is merely a backbencher, well then Mahinda Rajapaksa has been proved right. So that's the way I see it. And it's happened before in Sri Lanka, Stephanie. Before I was born, let alone you, but it's happened. In 1951, the very, very popular Prime Minister D.S. Senanayake died. In 1952, his son was swept into office by a sympathy vote, Mr. Dudley Senanayake. That government lasted till 1956. It was a one-term government. But in the middle, actually 1 year after he was appointed, Prime Minister Senanayake had to resign. Why? Because there was a massive, peaceful, but rather forceful, non-violent but forceful public uprising called the Hartal. It's an Indian term. The August 1953 Hartal, where women cooked hoppers on rail tracks and stopped trains and so on. Now, that caused the government of the day to be evacuated from Colombo and to take refuge on an American naval ship. So there was a dramatic turn. But the government itself remained the UNP government. The Prime Minister was replaced, and Mr. Dudley Senanayake was replaced by Sir John Kotalawala. But of course the government fell eventually, but it fell at an election, at the next election. So it's perfectly possible that this government will fall at the next election, which is actually not in 2020, as Uday Gammanpilla pointed out, because according to the Constitution, the presidential election has to be held at least 1 month before the conclusion of the term of the sitting president. And the sitting president concludes his term on the 8th of January 2020. So the presidential election has to be held the latest by December 2019. That's only 3 years to go, not 4 plus. So it's possible that the government will be replaced or will fall in December 2019, but this year, which Mahinda Rajapaksa has been targeting, could be the year in which you see a dramatic change or a replacement of the Prime Minister. If it doesn't happen, then Mahinda Rajapaksa will have been proven wrong by January 1, 2018.
Well, with that, let's head into a short commercial break. When we come back, we'll have more on Vantage Point. Welcome back. You're watching Vantage Point. Well, Dr. Jayatilaka, we saw MP Kelly Rambukwala make a statement saying that a group of thugs were actually used instead of the special task force during the Hambantota protest. Well, right now, at this point of time, we see the government's credibility suffer. And these statements that are made by the joint opposition is making it even worse. Do you agree?
Well, Stephanie, as the son of a journalist, I have been taught some techniques of trying to sift fact from propaganda. So, I mean, Kelly Rambukwala may be very well, may be telling the truth, but I'm not going by what he says, because he's a prominent member of the joint opposition. So when I want to figure out what happened in Hambantota, I look to the media, and I also look to people who are not members of the joint opposition and could in fact be against the joint opposition, but are not members of the government either. So what did I find? What I found was footage on your station, which is sort of hardly pro Mahinda Rajapaksa, and other stations, private stations. And I could see repeatedly, I could see a group with green banners and caps and so on, white long sleeve shirts, and a person who looked like but was not Ranjan Ramanayaka playing a lady in a movie called, I don't know, Maya or something like that. Rather a strapping person in a sari, hefting a huge rock. And I kept seeing this on all the coverage. So that told me that there were people who were not JO who were brandishing various implements and who seemed to have started throwing the stones at the other guys, who then picked the stones up and started throwing them back. That's point one. And this I saw in the coverage of all the private TV stations. Then we have, and mind you, I must remind viewers that I speak as somebody who opposed the previous government's use of violence in Ratapaswala. I spoke about it on television, and I in fact signed petitions together with Professor Rajiv Vijay Singh and former Ambassador Tamara Kununayagam. We signed petitions about Ratapaswala. So I don't have a problem. Whoever who uses force against unarmed demonstrators, I am against it. So I'm not speaking, in a partisan way. So the next thing, the next piece of information that made me prick up my ears was the press conference by the JVP. Now there's little love lost between the JVP and the JO. In fact, they're competitors. And Vijita Herath is quite anti-Rajapaksa, and he made no bones about it at his press conference yesterday or the day before. But I was listening to that, and he pieced together the entire Hambantota incident, and he very clearly put the blame on the UNP and certain sections of the state apparatus, and he said that the people who retaliated did so, it was justifiable that they were attacked first and therefore they threw back stones, and naturally they would do this. So he put the blame very squarely on the UNP, or at least certain members of the UNP. Then there were others at that press conference, including a young fellow who's obviously not a member of the JP Politburo, because I've never seen him before in my life, in a sort of a yellow T-shirt, which is not the sort of thing that the JVP leaders usually wear. Now, this was an inhabitant of Hambantota, probably sympathetic to the JVP. I don't know his name, but he gave even more detail, and he said that they couldn't step out of their houses, that the STF and the police had invaded their homes, that there was a heavy repression, and he mentioned UNP strong arm tactics, UNP thugs and so on and so forth. So therefore I have no choice but to conclude that the JO was more the victim, was more sinned against than sinning, and the people of the area were victims. This is what the JVP guys said, that there was a kind of an army of occupation. The green goons, as it were, I'm translating from the singular. There's a Mario, green goons plus STF and police and so on, using coercion, violence and repression against not only the demonstrators but the people of the area. Now that's very bad. That's the kind of nonsense that was done by the UNP in Jaffna. I remember during the 1980 DDC elections, and that radicalized Jaffna and the youth of Jaffna. So this is never a good tactic to use, and especially in the deep south, in the Ruhuna, which has been the area from which Sri Lanka has always seen rebellions arise. Now, it's not a good practice anywhere in the world. It's a particularly bad practice in an area which has a certain sense of a tradition of patriotic pride and rebellion. Not a smart move to make.
Well, we saw the former administration coming under a lot of fire because of the Ratapaswala protest and force use against unarmed civilians.
Yes.
So do you think the current administration will also come under a lot of fire by the United Nations because of the force that is used?
Well, the United Nations probably not, but public opinion in Sri Lanka, yes. And the previous government did all of that nonsense while the economy was growing at 6.5%. And the rupee was holding or was being held at a decent level. But this government is doing it when the growth rate is down to 4 point something and the rupee is spiraling downwards. So it's different when you do stupid stuff while you're not doing well in your economy, and when you do stupid stuff when your economy is doing well.
But still the former administration came under a lot of criticism.
It did.
Despite the fact that growth rate was high.
I mean, Ratapaswala was one of the turning points in what was to be the downfall of that government.
Well, right before we started off, or even when we started off, we spoke about it being 2 years since the president took over and the current administration really took over the country. But have we made progress, or is there any progress that we can make even further, despite the fact that there is some sort of failure to some degree?
Well, we have made progress, but the retrogression is greater than the progress made. So I'm not one of those who says there's not been progress, but I'm not one of those who say that the progress has been worth the price or that it has been greater than the retrogression. I think we've taken 1 step forward and 2 steps back, so it's a net loss rather than a net gain. What's the progress? I'm happy that there is a lighter touch in governance, not on the part of the Prime Minister but on the part of the President. He's simpler. The style is of governance is therefore more liberal and in a way more open, and that's not a small deal, that's a good thing. But that's not the most important thing there is. I mean, it's fine when that happens, but your rupee is holding steady and you're not imposing taxes, increasing taxes on people, and your growth rate is good. But if you can't get those fundamentals right, if those are going south, as it were, and you're more liberal and more open, I mean, that's nice, but that's just not good enough. So I think it's not a net gain. There's been progress. I'm not even saying not enough. What I'm saying is the progress has been more than offset by the negatives on basics.
Well, let's head into a short commercial break. When we come back, we'll have more on Vantage Point. Welcome back. You're watching Vantage Point. Well, Dr. Jayat Tilaka, there was this monetary board report that was released of the central bank bond transaction, but it's not in the public domain. However, a lot of opinions coming from experts. Experts really opine that the central bank governor should take the initiative of publishing it in order for everyone to know what really happened at the central bank. Well, what do you think the central bank governor should do? Do you think there should be more transparency than there was before?
Well, yes. I mean, there wasn't that much transparency before, but you didn't have something as big as the bond scam before. So this is huge, and yes, the central bank's findings should be made public because it's the public that's paying the price for the bond scam. So the report should come to Parliament, it should be debated in Parliament, and it should go public. I am fully with those who say that there has to be transparency because the central bank must show that even after the fact it's capable of a post-mortem, an audit. Otherwise, how can you trust that it won't happen again and people will just get away with it? The public must know. Now, that having been said, Stephanie, I was a little shocked to hear the finance minister criticize the governor of the central bank. This governor of the central bank is a very distinguished person, a distinguished economist, a product of Cambridge and Sussex, a PhD in economics. He's worked for the central bank before, he's worked for the Commonwealth Secretariat. He came back home to serve his country, unlike his predecessor. Now, I find it appalling that the finance minister doesn't have one word of criticism about Dr. Kumaraswamy's rather controversial predecessor, but he did criticize Dr. Kumaraswamy. And I think that's a travesty. And here I must say I'm very happy that we have Indrajit Kumaraswamy as the governor of the central bank, but that doesn't mean that he can't do better, such as by releasing the report into the bond scam.
So do you think there is opposition within the United National Party about the appointment of Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy? Because there has been a lot of questions surrounding as to why the central bank governor cannot publish this report. Do you think he is under a lot of pressure?
Well, I don't think there's opposition within the UNP or that the UNP as a whole is opposed to Indrajit Kumaraswamy. But I do think that he is under fire from a certain faction at the top of the UNP, and therefore he is being very careful. He probably is a little worried about releasing the report. But I think the media should continue its pressure and insist that the report be released.
Well, with that, let's wrap up this edition of Vantage Point. Remember, we believe that your perspective matters. Therefore, you can send us your questions and what you think about the show by sending us an email to newsfirst.lk. I'm Stephanie Lazarus. Thank you very much for joining us. Meet you next fortnight. Good night.